So we are very lucky to be joined again today by Scott Baker, who most of you will remember from the previous webinar on research cybersecurity. Scott manages the Research Cybersecurity and Compliance team within UBC's Advanced Research Computing Services, as well as the Compliance Support Program at PrISM Safety and Risk Services. So thank you, Scott, for leading another session for us, and I will let you take it from here.
Awesome. Well, thanks for having me. And I see some familiar faces in the crowd. So you guys who probably already know a lot of what I'm going to talk about, but we'll go through it anyway. Let me bring up this screen. And I can see both, I can see the chat while I'm talking. So I would encourage folks, if you want to make a comment or have a question about any of the stuff I'm talking about, please feel free to drop it in the chat. And I'll try to cover it as we go, but I'm also happy to speak with folks if you want to raise your hand and come off mute and talk. That works for me as well. So we'll kind of just play it by ear. I mentioned to somebody else who asked that I did cover some slides from this normal presentation in the previous session, which is available, and Nicole said she'd make that link available to everybody so you can see it on the YouTube channel. So you won't have missed anything, but I won't cover those again today, although I will cover some of the sort of introductory bits to just make sure we're all on the same page. But before I do that, let me just get this. Awesome. Okay. I just want to plug our Research Cybersecurity Enthusiast Award. If you're interested in signing up for that, we're awarding it to whoever attends the most of our sessions. There's one for the UBC department or group, and we take care of that one. So Nicole, you don't have to worry about that. But if anybody is interested in signing up for this, we're going to be awarding it during Cybersecurity Awareness Month, which is in October. And I'm going to drop the link for that in the chat right now. And it's just a very simple survey so that we can capture who you are, basically. And it does give you the option to leave some feedback about the presentation if you wish. So I am going to cover cybersecurity hygiene, and there were some questions from the previous session as well around sharing high-risk data and remote data collection, and I'll try to touch on those as I go through in some of the slides where that makes the most sense. But before I dive into it, I really want to just level set that cybersecurity is a very broad topic, and we all kind of come into that with a whole bunch of different backgrounds. Some people, and as I said, I recognize a few people on the call. Some people here have sort of a deeper understanding of technology, cybersecurity, privacy, regulation, and others may have less of a background in those areas and be more focused in something else. And that's fine. And I try to make this as broad spectrum as I can in terms of not diving too much into assumptions about technology or anything like that. But this is sort of what I live and breathe every day. So if you catch me using acronyms, then you don't know what they mean, or talking about a technology concept and you're completely lost, please drop something in the chat so that I know, because the intent here is to not leave anybody behind and not make it, too boring for the folks who have the technology background, but also not leave anybody behind who might not. In talking about cybersecurity in general, and this is a little bit of a repeat from last time, so I apologize for those that have been to both, but I think it's really important to talk about the fact that most of what we're looking at is trust. And the trust extends to a whole bunch of different things. It might extend to the systems that we use, the companies that provide them, the people that we work together with. And I use a little analogy to try to make this make more sense of building a ladder. So if I didn't want to trust anybody at all and build a ladder, I could probably do it. I could have to go to the forest, find a tree, cut it down myself, design the ladder, make sure I knew how to do that first, so that it would be appropriate and it would be able to withstand the weight and the length that I wanted. I would have to fasten it, stick it all together, make sure I treat the wood correctly and store it safely so it doesn't rot over time and become weak and brittle. Or I could just go to the hardware store and buy a ladder, which is what I think most people would do. But when you think about it, I'm trusting that somebody else has done all those things if I purchase that ladder. I'm trusting that it was designed properly. It's not going to break when I try to stand on it. it's the right length that I need, the fasteners, the glue, the wood, everything is correct. And it wasn't maybe stored incorrectly before it got to the hardware store and it's all rotten or something's wrong with it. That's a very simple thing, a wooden ladder. And if we then extend that concept and think about the computer systems and software and platforms that we use today, we're basically putting that same amount of trust into all the myriad pieces that come together to build out those particular systems. And it's an important concept when you think about cybersecurity to consider the fact that we're bestowing trust into all these little pieces as they stick together. And part of that is why we'll often talk about security as having a whole bunch of layers. For those familiar with the lingo, we call this defense in depth. What it really means is, in order to create something that's safer and more secure, we'll not just look for one thing to do to fix everything. It's usually a whole bunch of little things that we'll put together, different layers of protection, like having a strong door, but it's also locked, and maybe also a deadbolt, and maybe also a chain. All those different things come together. We're not just going to rely on one of them, we're going to rely on a whole bunch of them. And as I delve into the slides of this presentation, I think that's really important to keep in mind, because I don't expect anybody to do all of these things all the time. Each one of the things I'm going to share today is something you can do. You don't necessarily have to do all of them, but any one of them that you choose to do is going to make you just a little bit more safe and a little bit more secure. Finally, one more bit of sort of intro. Regardless of where you might be working, if it's UBC or maybe you're collaborating with somebody else, or maybe you move on and do something else at a different organization, or you volunteer at an organization, all these different places are going to have their own policies and procedures. And regardless of what I tell you, please follow the ones that are applicable to wherever you are. And that's because even though they might not be the latest, greatest in terms of best practices for security, probably everybody else there is working towards those policies and procedures as they do their job. The systems will be designed to be secure if those procedures are followed, and therefore it's almost always better and more secure to follow them than to try to do something else, even if the best practice is slightly different than what those policies and procedures might be. All right, there's two different kinds of slides in this. One is a proactive slide. It looks like this. It'll have a title, some sort of short description, and then really cover off some tools and tactics and techniques you can do to make yourself more secure. The important thing is in the top corner where it's got that little graph, and it's really measuring three things about this type of practice that you can do. The first one is how hard it will be to implement. Is this going to be a lot of work, or is it super simple? The second one is how much of an interference it will be on your day-to-day life. Like implementing this is going to make it really hard to do stuff, or you won't even notice. And then finally, how much of a security improvement is it going to make for you? And sometimes I'll have a bonus tip thrown in there as well. The other kind of slide is a reactive slide. So this is what you would do after something has happened. And so on the one side, it'll describe what that something might be, and the other, what sort of things you could do about it. And this one just has one little graph that sort of shows how technically savvy you need to be in order to maybe do this practice. And I've called it a geekometer just for fun. I always like to show the fact that there are a bunch of resources that relate to all the slides in this deck. Those are all the resources. You don't have to memorize those now, but just to prove that they are there, they sit right at the beginning, although I'll reference them when I go into the slides. So with all that, we can finally get started with some of the tips. So in the previous session, I talked about having a unique password for everything, but in order to do that, you kind of have to have a place to put them. And password vaults are one of the best ways to deal with that sort of thing. You'll find in your day-to-day life now, if you haven't already, you're going to have hundreds, maybe thousands of passwords you need to keep track of, all these different accounts on all kinds of different systems. And if you're following my advice from the previous session, every single one of those is going to be different. There's no way you're going to remember it. And in fact, if you've made it easy enough that you can remember it, it's probably too simple. And it's guessable, therefore, and not very secure in terms of a password. So always better to use some sort of a vault. But I have a couple of other tips about password vaults that make them super useful beyond just storing your password. So first of all, they can generate passwords for you of any complexity. You can usually put in the rules and it'll generate it for you, which is really helpful, makes it easy. It can save you time because you don't have to type in your password. Usually there's some sort of a hotkey or it just pops up a request saying, hey, this is the right password for this particular thing you're signing into. And so it'll type it in for you, which saves you time over quickly. But I also like to suggest that you store other sorts of secrets in a password vault. My very, very favorite one is storing your credit card number in a password vault. And the reason is anytime you go to buy something online and you have to enter your credit card, it's a real pain to try to read it off the back of the card when the numbers have kind of gotten scratched off because you kept it in a bag or a wallet or something. It's maybe getting a little old, hard to read the numbers. But then you also have to read it in versus just using the hotkey from your password vault and having it automatically type it into the field for you. It also means that your credit card number, should you lose it, is available to you to give to the credit card company and say, hey, I lost my card and this is its number. I don't have the card anymore, but I have it in my password vault. So it's a really handy one. The other thing about password vaults, and probably better to call them secret vaults, because they can store all sorts of things, is you can put files into almost all of them. And when you think about places you'd want to store somewhat sensitive information, it's a really good location for that. One of the things I always do is when I'm going traveling, I keep a up-to-date scan of my passport, any sort of ID I might need, driver's license, all of that in my password vault as an image, so that if I'm away and it gets lost or stolen, I immediately have a copy of it I can present to whatever authority I might need to in that foreign location. And that can be a really big time saver and pain saver if you are in that sort of a situation. Finally, the last tip, some people feel it might be a little bit morbid, but I think it's a really nice thing to do for your family. If anything were to happen to me, the password to my password vault is actually in my will. And that would allow any of my family to get into all my passwords, which would also allow them to get into all my online accounts and deal with whatever they might need to deal with in the event that I'm incapacitated or pass away for whatever reason. But I don't leave them with the pain of having to figure out how can they get into my old something account to deal with the fact that there's people trying to contact me there and they have no way to respond or even know if they are, and I'm not going to be responding. So it's a really simple thing you can do to simplify things for your loved ones, is to just put the password for your master password in your will somewhere. So a lot of tips with that one. I find it a really helpful thing. And the thing I like about password vaults, it actually saves you time because you don't have to type in your password anymore. You don't have to type in the credit card numbers anymore. So not only do they make you significantly more secure, they actually save you a lot of time on your day-to-day. So strong recommendation on that one. The next one is about encryption. And at UBC, we do have encryption requirements in our policies that relate to both full disk encryption for devices, certain types of file and database encryption. They're defined in the standards, but this is sort of more general outside of just UBC about the benefits that you can have when you use encryption for a variety of different reasons. You can have two main types of encryption: encryption in transit, which is how data is protected when it's going from one location to another. Or you could have encryption at rest, which is when encryption is used to protect data that's stored on a storage volume somewhere. So it might be on a USB stick, or it might be on a hard drive, or it might be in a cloud service. But you can encrypt all of those things at rest, it's called. You don't need special software in general to encrypt something. Even the WinZip program on Windows gives you the option to set a password and encrypt it. You have to make sure that you've got the right version and you specify that I want to encrypt it. There's a lot of other software out there that will do different various types of encryption, but it's not a difficult thing to do. There's one here that I've mentioned called Cryptomator that I use quite often. It sets up what looks like another hard drive on your computer, but it's actually just an encrypted folder somewhere, and everything you put in and out of this hard drive gets automatically encrypted by the software, and it's free. It's really nice. The neat thing about stuff like that, and there's a few other ones that do the same thing. There's paid versions. I think it's called Box Cryptor is another one. But if you put that encrypted folder on something like a cloud storage location like Dropbox or Google Drive or sync.com or something like that, then everything that you put in and out and take out of that particular cloud storage is also encrypted. And in this day and age with AI data scraping and the concerns around cloud service providers having access to our data, that can be a really useful thing to do. If you're collaborating with another group of people, as long as everybody has the master password for that encrypted folder, it doesn't add any challenge or difficulty in terms of accessing those files. It's totally transparent. But the service provider, wherever you're storing that stuff, doesn't have any access to that data at all because it's encrypted. And this is where I was going to just touch on that. The question from the previous one was around sharing high-risk data. If you pre-encrypt the data before you share it, such that the person that you're sharing it with can unencrypt it later, it significantly improves the ability for you to share that data safely. Because as that encrypted block of information traverses the internet and goes from one location to another, nobody along the path is going to be able to access it. Only the person that has the decryption key at the other end is going to be able to get access to it. And it opens up a lot more flexibility in terms of the methods you might use to share that data. Now, a lot of the systems that we have already available to us, for example, again, at UBC with things like SharePoint, OneDrive, Teams, those automatically encrypt the data in transit. They don't always encrypt it at rest from people who have access to it. You need to have access to it in order to share it. But as it's going between one place to another, it will be encrypted. So a lot of that sort of happens, again, transparently in the background. But if you were really concerned and you felt that the data was of a sort of a very sensitive nature, you might want to put another layer of encryption on top of it. And there's nothing wrong with doing that. It just adds another layer of protection. So there's lots of different ways you can do that. There are some sharing services. Sync.com is one example. And again, I'm sort of speaking generally, not specific to UBC. UBC doesn't have any arrangement with Sync.com, although there are groups that use it. It uses something called zero-knowledge encryption. So you set up a password for that sync.com for you. Somebody else you're sharing with does the same thing. Sync.com can't look at the data that you put into their system because it's protected through the encryption that you've set up on each end. That's why it's called zero-knowledge. They have no knowledge of the decryption methodology to access that data. It's end-to-end encrypted between you and whoever you're sharing it with. So it's another very good way to do that. Things like Google Drive and Dropbox are not like that. Those companies do have access to everything you put unencrypted into those storage locations. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. Just seeing a question in the chat. So with this in mind, I'll just read it out. Thanks, Stephen. With this in mind, the handling of encrypted data with respect to U1 policy and data sovereignty, medium risk data and above being stored outside of Canada. So yeah, this is one of those things. If you have concerns about data stored with a third-party provider anywhere, the country is somewhat less relevant, but if it's stored outside, and you're worried that somebody's going to access it, if you encrypt it yourself and you have access to the encryption keys and they're maintained with your group, then whoever that provider isn't going to be able to access that information. It's completely opaque to them. So it's a really good way to keep your information safe and not allow it to be read, used for AI training, used for anything else. It's entirely captured locally. Another thing to keep in mind with this is if people are turning on AI agents in some of these storage systems, like Microsoft has an AI agent that can access SharePoint. If you don't want it to access that information, pre-encrypting it is another way to prevent that entirely, because the agent won't have the decryption key. It won't be able to do anything with it. So encryption is really powerful. The other nice thing it has, and I'll talk about this next, is if something's been encrypted when it goes up into a cloud storage location and you delete it and you've got the encryption key, you don't really have to worry about it lingering around in cloud storage. So I'll explain this a little bit more. When you have a file on your hard drive and you just click the delete button, it doesn't actually erase the data on your hard drive. It just tells the file system that file is no longer there. So it removes effectively an entry that says, if you want to read this particular data, go look at this spot on the hard drive, it deletes that. But the data is still actually on the hard drive. The only way to fully erase it is to overwrite it with something else, which happens over time because that space is now marked free. But it's important to keep in mind the same thing happens in the cloud. So if you really want to be sure your data is deleted, you have to check if the cloud provider actually is fully deleting it, or if they'll give you a certificate of deletion, or maybe it's still stored in a backup somewhere. But if it's been encrypted and you controlled the keys, as soon as you erase it, it's of no use to anybody else. Nobody will be able to get to it because the keys aren't available. And you can also delete the encryption keys if you want to be really safe and secure. And that's actually a government-sanctioned method of securely erasing information, is deleting the encryption key, and then nobody has access to that information anymore. So just some things to think about that encryption can buy you with respect to highly sensitive data, or something that you really want to make sure is only available to a very specific set of individuals, or accessed by only a very specific set of systems or agents. The next one I'll touch on is AI deepfakes. I've had this slide in this presentation, which I've been giving for quite a few years. But the level of ease with which you can create deepfakes today is almost comically easy. I can clone somebody's video and voice with about 10 seconds of a video of that individual, and I can do it on my home computer, and I can bet you wouldn't be able to tell, and it takes minutes to do. It's that easy. So one of the really important things to consider is anytime you get a voice message or a call or even a video message, and it might be related to work, but it might also be related to your family, you have to be very skeptical. If it sounds like, a plea for help or something that's urgent, needs to be done, somebody needs help right away, I would be highly reluctant to just accept it at face value in this day and age. And instead, I'd want to double check using some other means of contacting that person. So if they phoned me, I would then instead send a message on Teams. If I got a message on Teams, I might phone them. If I got it in an email, I might try a text message, some other pathway to communicate with that person, especially if what they're suggesting is something that's out of character, or you weren't aware that they were even traveling, and yet this message is saying they're traveling and they're trapped and they need some help and some money and something. I've added a bit at the bottom, which is somewhat debatable, about having sort of a key phrase for your family. I think rather than a key phrase, it's actually a little bit easier to ask a negative truth question. And what I mean by that is the question can be, oh, hey, how's the cat doing? But you don't have a cat and they don't have a cat. And you know that, but somebody who's trying to social engineer you would have a lot of trouble guessing that you didn't have a cat. Whereas if you ask for what's the secret phrase, they can usually say things like, oh no, I forgot, please just, I can't do it this time. These people are very highly trained in their ability to do that sort of thing. And it's not as safe as it might be. The other pathway of communication is usually the best thing to do. Okay, I see a couple of things in the chat. Question there about, are encryptions actually foolproof? And will this change more with developments? I'm guessing developments meaning new developments, probably thinking about quantum computing and stuff like that. I have a whole presentation on quantum computing and what that actually means. To keep this as short as I can, if you recall, I mentioned that there's two kinds of encryption, in transit and at rest. Encryption at rest usually uses something called symmetric encryption, where there's a single key and both parties who might be accessing that information have that one key. It's the same key, and they use it to encrypt and decrypt that piece of data. That method is not at risk from quantum computing. Even if quantum computing was to come very quickly, which is very debatable, that risk, as long as you've used a relatively strong key, you're pretty good. There's no real risk there. But when you're trying to send something encrypted in transit over the internet, the problem is the person at the other end somehow needs to know what key to use to decrypt the information. And we call that key exchange, when I need to get the key that I've used from my end over to somebody else. And there's a specific other kind of encryption, asymmetric encryption, that is used to accomplish this task. That's the one that can be susceptible to quantum computing. And there are already algorithms available that are what they refer to as quantum safe. And the good thing to know is that a lot of vendors are already using them. Google already uses it, Microsoft, AWS. It's available for SSH and Linux, although you have to be on a recent version of it. So a lot of this stuff is just changing automatically by vendors adopting it. But if you have the option to use a quantum safe encryption for the key exchange, which is the most important part, then it's worth doing. It's just going to be a matter mostly of if what you're using supports it or not. But I also wouldn't say that it's a hair on fire thing to worry about. The government is very worried about it because they know that foreign powers are capturing information today, saving it, and waiting until they can use a quantum computer at some point in the future to decrypt that information. That would mean they would have had to have captured the moment when you exchanged the keys for that information as well. And if they've already done that, it's already too late. There's nothing you can do about it. But if they haven't, and you're using one of the quantum safe encryptions on something like your VPN, or it's part of the Microsoft suite or the Google suite or AWS or SSH, and any one of those have it turned on, then you're already safe. So the advice there, I would say, is don't panic. Don't worry about the information that's stored on a disk. There's nothing you need to do to change anything there. It's all about when you're exchanging keys with somebody else to try to make sure you use a quantum safe crypto scheme when you do that. And I think Stephen's just kind of doubling down on that. Yeah, it's something you should do. The good news is a lot of the vendors are already doing it. And so we can just watch and choose vendors and platforms and services that use those types of encryption. Okay, moving on to the next one. So this one I know is a particular bugbear of one of the folks I work with at UBC's cybersecurity office. He is very concerned about people scanning QR codes left, right, and center. The important thing to think about with a QR code is where you're seeing it, because they can contain all kinds of things. We're very used to QR codes containing links to websites, but that's not the only thing they can contain. They can be set up to automatically join you to a Wi-Fi network, or they can contain somebody's contact information or just a number. They can contain all sorts of triggers depending on the device that you use to scan it. So for the most part, we're using them in a really good way. We're using them to share links so that people can quickly get to a link with their phone where you don't want to type something in on a tiny little keyboard. But you have to think of how much do I trust? And it's back to that trust again, the source of that QR code before I scan it. And ideally, your phone should be set up to let you look at where it's going to go before you scan it. I see some smiling faces, so maybe somebody scanned the code on the screen. The area where you want to be the most concerned about a QR code is on a poster. And any sort of a sticker-based QR code, because you have no idea who stuck that there. I see them on lamp standards downtown, and it always baffles me that anybody would ever scan something stuck to a lamppost in the middle of a city. It could contain anything and take you to any sort of a website. Who knows? But even on a white space in a poster that's stuck up on a poster board in one of the buildings at UBC, somebody could have come along and just stuck a sticker on top of the poster. You don't really know if that QR code is supposed to be part of that poster or not. Or they might have stuck their own QR code over top of another QR code. It's really very difficult to tell. The safest thing to assume is relatively trustworthy is a QR code you see on a screen, because you can't stick a sticker over that. It means that whoever's providing the information on the screen is actually providing the QR code. And so I wouldn't suggest that you should never use them in presentations and on screen displays. There's a really good place for a QR code. They have their uses. But if it's a sticker stuck to something, and I know a lot of devices nowadays have a little tiny QR code that you scan that to start registering the device, I'd be very leery of those sorts of things. unless I was the one that took the thing out of the box in the first place when I was installing it. If it's just sitting there and it's been out for any length of time, I'd see if there's a way for me to get to that thing some other way where I'm not scanning a code and I actually know what URL I'm accessing. Okay, here's another. Oh, actually, one more, the bonus tip for the QR code. If you're the person generating QR codes, there's a lot of different QR code generators online that will generate a QR code for you. You type in the website address you want to go to, it'll generate a code. They're not all nice. And some of them will actually change the link to run it through something that they use to inject advertising or maybe capture some information or something as somebody uses that QR code. Because again, the QR code itself just contains a link. So they adjust the link. It'll still send the person to the same place, but it'll go via their system first. And so the tip I have there is check and make sure that the QR code you create actually goes to the link you wanted it to. It's really quite convenient that a bunch of the browsers now actually will generate a QR code for you if you just right-click on the background of your web browser and say generate QR code. Sometimes it's in the menu, sometimes it's a right-click on the address bar, but most of the browsers will do it for you and they won't touch or change the link. But I would still just double-check, make sure that what you get is what you were expecting to get. Okay, another probably fairly timely one, and this one comes up a lot in talking to folks that are uncomfortable traveling to a particular location for whatever reason. I think we all know there's increased geopolitical tensions across the world. I'm not being specific about any country. There's a whole bunch of different places where this is a factor, and it's even a factor coming across the border back into Canada. Border agents have the authority to look at your devices. So you hear a lot of people talking about burner phones. And that's just basically a phone or device that doesn't have anything on it, pretty much just blank. But that might not be enough, because in this day and age now, if you cross the border and you have a phone that has absolutely nothing on it, that's in itself probably going to raise some eyebrows. It's like, why? Why do you have nothing on your phone? So one of the things you might want to consider doing if you're in that situation, and there's many reasonable reasons to be in that situation, is also bring a letter that explains why. And you can basically just say, oh, my employer says that I'm not allowed to have my work phone. They give me a specific phone I have to use when I'm traveling, or a specific laptop I have to use when I'm traveling. And you can actually get that at UBC if you need it. It's available through Privacy Matters. If you want a document, you can just print it. It's pretty nondescript. It just says this is a requirement of employment at UBC to have this device for this particular trip. And now it's not on you anymore. It's on the employer, and it won't raise anywhere near as many questions at the border. But I would suggest that for anybody else. If you're in a different situation working for another institution, see if they'll do that for you. It's a handy extra safeguard. But the other thing that I feel is worth noting is border guards have your name, address, and everything else. If you're worried about what they might find out about you in something like social media or your field of study or what you might be currently researching, most of that information doesn't need to have your phone scanned. You can just Google yourself and find it out. And they have access to far more than we would have access to just using open source intelligence. So one of the things I think is a very worthwhile thing to do before you travel to a questionable location or a location that makes you concerned is search for yourself online and see what comes up. Because they're going to have access at least to that amount of information when you cross the border. And it's an important thing just to be aware of, because I think in this respect, awareness is a big part of the game. So think about that. Also remember that deletion thing that I mentioned. If you just delete the app from your phone, it may not actually delete the information from your phone. Same is even definitely more true with a laptop, because it's just going to delete the index to it. So again, if you've encrypted your devices, you have an extra layer of protection. But most borders, most crossings in the world will have the authority to ask you to unlock your device. And there's nothing you can do about it legally when you cross that border. So maybe not the most comforting. I don't have a lot of good, this is the silver bullet that's always going to make it work. But awareness, I think, is a big part of it. And I was just seeing a note in the chat too that McAfee has a new tool that scans the QR code to make sure it's safe and trustworthy. I haven't tried that. I mean, that makes sense. It's similar, I think, to clicking on a link in Teams. It does that, we're checking the link. It's looking at a list of known bad links. So yeah, any layers, again, additional layers of protection you can pop in there are going to make you more secure. But looking at the link, especially before you go there, is really, really important. The next one I think is much better known now, but I always like to double down on it, and that's the use of a VPN. Again, sort of following along with the traveling aspect, but it's not only travel, it also plays into any time you're on a large public Wi-Fi network, or even a small one. So if I'm at a conference and the hotel provides Wi-Fi for the people at the conference, when I connect to that network, I'm on that same network with everybody else at that conference, and I'm trusting that that hotel's Wi-Fi is secure, which it may not be. At UBC, we have a huge Wi-Fi network, one of the largest ones that's around, and there's all kinds of work being done on a regular basis to keep it secure. We use certificates, there's encryption, but if you're just using an open Wi-Fi at a hotel or a conference or an airport or a hotel that you're traveled to somewhere else, you don't know if any of that is in place. You don't know even if that Wi-Fi is necessarily the right one. If you've ever heard of a concept called a watering hole attack, it's where somebody parks a van right outside a coffee shop. They set up a Wi-Fi network in the van. They call it whatever the name of that coffee shop is, and then everybody who goes to the coffee shop connects to that Wi-Fi thinking it's the coffee shop's Wi-Fi, whereas in fact, the coffee shop doesn't even have Wi-Fi. Or they do, but this one's really, really powerful, and it outshines the coffee shop's Wi-Fi. So never everybody's connected to it. And when you connect to a Wi-Fi network, or any network for that matter, people who are on that network can see what you're doing. If you use a VPN, it encrypts all of the traffic that goes from your device over to wherever the endpoint of that VPN is. And so it makes your activity on that network generally opaque to anybody that might be snooping on it. So it's a really good extra layer of protection to use anytime you're on any sort of Wi-Fi service where you don't know the security of it and you don't know who else might be on there. It's very easy to set up. They're quite inexpensive. Beware of ones that are free VPNs or super cheap VPNs. There's a lot of sketchy ones out there as well. So I would go with one of the sort of brand name ones. I use one called ExpressVPN. There's NordVPN, ProtonVPN are all fairly well-known names. I've linked to an article there. It's probably a couple years old now that lists a bunch of them that are trustworthy. But I would suggest a free VPN probably would make me nervous. If you're doing anything for work, UBC has a VPN. You can use that for personal use as well when you travel. It's going to route it through UBC, but it's not going to let somebody snoop on you. A question, are there any recommendations for when VPNs, particularly the UBC VPNs, are found to be blocked? Yeah, and there are situations where, depending on how the VPN works, the port that it uses on the network might not work, or because of the geopolitical concerns of a particular location, they might try to block VPNs. Sometimes using a different VPN will use a different port and might get you through, so you can have a couple different ones in your back pocket. I myself have like 3 VPNs I can jump through. So I have the UBC one, obviously, that everybody here would have. I have ExpressVPN that's on all my devices. And then I also run one at my home that uses a different technology. And between all those different things, hopefully one of them will get through. Sometimes it doesn't. And then I have to decide, okay, how badly do I need this Wi-Fi? Or maybe the safer thing for me to do is just use the phone network. And I can always also run a VPN over the phone network, same thing, if I'm in an unusual location. But yeah, it's some networks, the way they're set up, don't make VPN use easy. So yeah, seeing Stephen said it was on a trip on a cruise ship. Yeah, I've encountered hotels in Europe as well where I just couldn't get some of the VPNs to work, but sometimes other ones will. So I would suggest have a couple that preferably use slightly different technology and see if one of them will get through or maybe the other one won't. There are places too that intentionally try to do tricks with the network to make the VPN. You'll connect, but then when you try to actually do anything that involves moving data through it, that connection, it's really, really, really slow. And it's probably not the VPN. It's probably something the network person is doing whatever Wi-Fi you're on. So it's not always a perfect solution, but always use one if you can. It's going to be much, much safer for a lot of reasons. All right, this one is a follow-on from something I did talk about last time, which was browser extensions and local installs of AI software. But this one is more general, and it's talking about what you allow AI to access and the agency you give it in terms of what it can do. And I think right now we have a lot of different people experimenting with all kinds of different sorts of AI. And it's the hot topic. Everybody's doing it. Not everybody's doing it very safely. So when you have something that is referred to as an AI agent, and the most common ones that we're hearing about right now are things like Claude Code, Cowork, Clawbot, or Moltbot. There's a bunch of other ones, but the majority of people I hear are either using Cowork or Claude Code type of agentic AI. They will generally want to access things on your behalf. These might just be files on your computer. It might be files on a network file storage. It might be your GitHub account. It might be your email. And depending on what you give it access to, it will do more and less various things to hopefully give you a productivity boost. But it's really important to consider what sort of things you allow these AI agents to access, keeping in mind that AI itself is non-deterministic, somewhat random, and subject to erroneous output and action. So if you grant it access to things that are important, you can potentially lose them. And there's been some fairly high-profile situations where people in the AI industry have granted an agent access to their mailbox and ended up with getting all their mail deleted, or granted AI access to their code repository and having that code repository get deleted or altered or damaged in a significant way. I'm not suggesting just don't use any of this stuff, but you have to think carefully when you do use it. So the common suggestion is to sandbox the access of these agents. But doing that for the average person is actually quite challenging. Knowing how to sandbox your network, how to sandbox the access of a piece of software that's running on your own computer can be challenging. There's settings in the AI agentic software that do this, but we've already seen cases where the AI has just gone around those settings and done something else. So I would suggest that just using the settings that come with the software probably isn't enough. You want to be even more specific. And I'll give a couple of really common examples. So let's say I wanted to use an AI agent to help me with some coding that I'm doing. And I want that agent to go in and look at my code base and maybe make some suggestions or scan it for vulnerabilities, whatever, useful functions that it can do. I don't necessarily want to give it access to my production code base. I will create a copy of the code just for the AI and let it look at that. That way it can't damage my actual source of truth code that other people are trying to keep up to date. That is my one true copy. It's got its own copy. And if it messes up, I'll be like, oh, well, it messed up my copy. I'll just copy over it with the fresh one again. That way I'm totally safe from that. That's a really easy way to sandbox the code. So I would never give it access using my account or any other account for that matter to that main repository. I just give it a copy. And the same is kind of true for documents. If you're having AI read through a document that is important and you need to make sure that document is accurate, it's much safer to ask an AI agent or bot to look at a document and give you a list of things that you should change, rather than asking it to make changes in the document. Because with the list, if it makes a mistake, you'll see it as you're going through to make those changes. If you just ask it to make changes to the document, you have no idea what it changed in that document. It might tell you it changed one thing, but it might have changed 5 things. So it's always safer to just ask for a list and not have it make the changes itself. And sort of similar to what Stephen was saying in the chat there, best to avoid carte blanche. Yes, entirely for AI agents. I would suggest if you need to give an AI agent access to something, make sure it has its own account that is read-only, so that no matter what the agent tries to do, it can't make changes to things. Think very long and hard about what that access might grant it. Just like giving access to another person, we should always be following the concept of least privilege, which means you shouldn't have access to something that you don't need in order to do your job. And some of these AI agentic installs will say, "Oh, just give me, the keys to the kingdom. Give me everything, and I promise I'll only use the bits that I need." But that's not going with least privilege. That's just giving it everything. The safer thing to do is say, "Well, I need it to work on this one thing, so I will give it access to a copy of this one thing, and I'm pretty safe that way." There's a question in chat: can we use built-in Copilot on Excel sheets with high-risk information? Microsoft already has all the UBC data. Copilot drives me crazy because there's 3, sometimes 4, depending on how you look at it, different Copilots. UBC has done PIAs on some of the specific Copilots. Their names have changed multiple times throughout this process, and it's really frustrating. They all have Copilot in the name, but there's the Copilot, and rather than going with what they're called, I'm going to explain how you access them. There's the Copilot that shows up in your Windows taskbar. There's the Copilot that shows up in Excel with a little button. There's the Copilot you go to on the website for Copilot chat. You have to go to the website. And then there's another one that you can access through an app and or through Teams. These are all slightly different, and some of them can be used with high-risk information from UBC, and some of them can't. The most important trigger is that it's actually the Copilot that is enterprise licensed to UBC. And the safest way to tell is to look in the Copilot window. There should be a green shield or check marks that actually indicates that it's the enterprise version. The really safe way to know is if you signed into it with any account other than your UBC account, then no, it's not suitable for use with very high risk information, or even high risk information for that matter, or even medium risk information for that matter from UBC. All the rest of them are just low risk, but the enterprise one has been approved for medium risk with a PIA. They've looked at that. Again, even though Microsoft already has UBC data stored, in a lot of cases that's encrypted in various means. One of the problems with a lot of the AI systems, and again, a lot of people will worry about AI being trained on a particular piece of sensitive information. The new models are trillions of parameters, which means just think of a parameter as a small chunk of piece of information. There's trillions of them. So when you train something that has a sea of a trillion pieces of information with a tiny piece of your sensitive information, it kind of gets lost in the ocean. However, when these companies are keeping the data so that they can train with it, they're keeping the plain text, unencrypted, raw data with your whatever is sensitive to you in a database somewhere. My concern is more about how they're protecting that information than the actual training of the AI. It was more common when AI first started and we were looking at things that were less than 1 billion parameters that information could leak out. But it's much more unlikely now with these huge models that things will leak. Much more likely that an AI agent will get access to something it shouldn't and disclose it that way, or that the actual information store where these vendors are keeping vast troves of data could eventually get breached, and somebody would access the sensitive data that way rather than through the AI model itself. That's somewhat of a personal opinion. I don't have hard facts to back that up, but it does follow from a logical perspective. And I have talked to some people who are deep into AI and they would agree with that. Again, if you have high risk information and you would like to do things with AI, then there's specific solutions you can use that can do that. But one of the safest is to just remove the sensitive information from that, whatever it is, a document, Excel sheet, just fuzz it so it's no longer sensitive. It has personal information, remove the columns with that, or rotate the names, or pre-encrypt them somehow, create a crosswalk file. There's lots of things you can do to remove the sensitive information before you let the AI look at it. And Yeah, it's very difficult. It's a fledgling industry where people are moving very, very fast, and the security isn't necessarily all that strong. A lot of the vendors are saying, like Anthropic now, with their latest model, Fable, even if you get an enterprise license, they're still going to capture all your data um, and store it somewhere so that they can use it for various other reasons. The claim in this is that they're doing it so that they can make sure people aren't abusing the model. And they need it for their own liability. And I've seen that discussion come up in a few legal forums as well. It's a tricky area. If you have for example, a chatbot and you're talking with an AI, then even let's say you're providing it actually at UBC, you were trying to provide a chatbot. You kind of have to log the chats in order to make sure that the chatbot hasn't said the wrong thing to somebody. But now you're logging the chats, and whatever that person puts in there, you've got a copy of, which is potentially a freedom of information accessible item. And now you're creating a potential privacy risk just by running the chatbot and keeping the information that you would need in order to justify what the chatbot might have said. So it's a prickly pear, this one, and a tricky situation to look at. There are local AI models you can run on your own machine. And I would strongly suggest playing around with some of those. Sometimes you need a reasonably powerful GPU to do it, but you can get versions of most models open source that don't. And as long as you don't allow that to go out to the internet or talk to anything, that entirely local model, nothing leaves your computer. So it's a much easier way to look at some of these things without risking accidental data disclosure. If you want to look into that, and I don't have time today, obviously, to go into a whole bunch of details, but there's a very common one that a lot of people use is called LM Studio. And it runs entirely locally on the machine. You download a model, you execute the model, and it works just like a chatbot. It's specifically for LLMs. A lot of my slides, you may have noticed, have AI graphics in them. Thanks, Stephen. It's in the chat. And I do that all locally on my own machine as well. I don't use AI services unless I really don't have any other choice. If I'm trying to search for something on the internet, then I might use an AI service to help me find that thing. But for the most part, I run everything locally. But I have a fairly powerful GPU here, and it gives me the ability to do that. Okay, I'm going to do one more, and we've only got 5 minutes left. And again, I appreciate the chat questions. Feel free to drop in anytime if you've got a question or put up your hand even. But this last one also kind of ties into the AI thing. And it's keeping your work and personal identities separate. When I originally put this in, it was prior to AI, but it makes even more of an importance now, I think, to think about this, because what a lot of people are doing is they're getting AI accounts with their personal email information and then using it for work purposes, which is really, really prickly and sticky and not something you should generally do. It's not acceptable under most UBC policy. So it's important to keep that in mind. The other way around is also sticky for you if you start using your work email for personal matters. Keeping in mind that we work at a public institution, we are subject to freedom of information requests. So if you have elements of your personal correspondence in your work email, that could end up falling into an FOI request unintentionally or otherwise, like regardless of the nature of what that request might be. Yes, they get filtered. They're only supposed to be specific to the request, but it's still a bit of a messy situation. Also, if you leave the organization and somebody needs access to your email to get documents that are related to your job, they might inadvertently see personal information that really shouldn't be there. So in general, I would strongly suggest if you're doing something for work, make it a work thing. If you're doing something for personal, make it a personal thing, and try to keep those two things as separate as possible. Don't use your personal stuff for work, as in don't sign up for ChatGPT with your Gmail address and then start using that to do work stuff, and vice versa. Don't start doing personal stuff about your trip planning using a AI that's a UBC based one. They really should try to keep those two things separate as much as possible. The other thing that where that can come into, and the bonus tip here is consider what happens when you give out your work email address in terms of conference spam and things like that. It can start to build up in your inbox pretty quick. So with 3 minutes left, I guess I may have one more I can just squeak in, and then I'll turn it back. Similarly to that, if you're going to be doing a bunch of different things, we have the advantage of having a whole bunch of different web browsers at our disposal. And when you use a particular web browser and you sign into something and you click the Remember Me box, you are now signed in, but you're signed in on that web browser. And what I tend to do is use different web browsers for different things. So I have, if I really want to do things like Gmail or Google Maps, I don't actually use Gmail all that much. But if I want to use Google Maps, a lot of that's built into Chrome, and it's much faster if I use the Chrome browser. So I'll use the Chrome browser for that. But I don't like Google tracking me with all the other stuff that I do. So when I'm doing my personal banking or my email on Proton Mail or something like that, I don't use Chrome. I'll use either Brave or Vivaldi or Firefox or Opera. And I have all those different browsers and I use them all for different things. It can also be a handy way to keep your work and your personal accounts separate. If you use one browser always for your personal and another one always for your work, it helps keep that segregation in place just from a technical perspective. So why don't I stop there and turn it back to Nicole to close out with 2 minutes, well, a little less than 2 minutes left.
Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you so much, Scott, for your time.
No problem. Always a pleasure.
Have a great day.
Take care, everybody.